The following is a real-time process of computerized pattern making when given only a specification sheet and a sketch to work from. By simply starting with one rectangle, I will be able to make the entire garment to spec in under 40 minutes using the powerful and intuitive tools in Tukatech's TUKAdesign application. Let's begin. The following will show how to make a pant in Tukacad simply from a sketch and a spec sheet. We have our spec sheet and our sketch. If we take a look at the spec sheet, we can see that we have a base size 27 for the pant. And we have all our points of measure. So we begin by starting with the inseam and the front rise. And we'll begin by making a rectangle and starting with these measurements. My working units are set up to be in inches. So I'm going to create a new file and start with a rectangle. I'll give this the name front. And for our X length, we have 40 and 1/8 of an inch. And the Y, if we look at our spec sheet and we look at the thigh measurement, of course this is going to be half panel, so we're going to take this 10 inches. So now that we have our block, I press the F8 key and I can quickly see my measurements between the grading points. So now I'm going to take the draft tool and I'm going to put a center line, my center fold line right down the middle of the block. So here I'm just drafting the line, and then the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add points, reference points, to define our waistline. So if we take a look at our waist measurement, waist circumference is 31 total. We're going to now add our points because we're dividing this by 8. So on either side of the center line I'm putting 3.875 on one side of the line, and you see here I'm adding a point, the exact same distance on the opposite side of the line. The next reference point we need to add is going to be for the crotch measurement. So here I'm going to add a point 6 1/4 inches from the end of the waist. I'm using 6 1/4 because you can see here that we have 6 1/8 on the spec sheet, but we still haven't lowered yet the shape of the waist. Next we will go back to the spec sheet and we're going to put low hip position from waist. So again, I add my point. This will be 4 inches from the previous. And we add our other point, which is 1.5 inches. So now these reference points are in place. I'm going to zoom in here and take the move point tool, and I'm simply going to drag this corner point in, change the attribute to curve, and now with my move point tool I can come in and reshape my rise. Here I need to lower this point 1/2 inch in the X direction, and now you can see we have the shape starting to take form. Now we're going to drag in some guidelines just by clicking and dragging from the edge of the screen, so we can take a look at our spec sheet See what our high hip. See that we have 35 inches. So what I'm going to do is offset this 8 3/4 of an inch, my guideline, and for the low hip position we're going to do the same. So if I double click on the guideline, we can offset this to 9 1/4. So now our reference lines are in place. Now I'm going to take my Move Parallel tool and I'm going to lower this segment so that this point is touching the guideline. And if I zoom in here, we're going to add a point for our low hip and high hip position. So now we're going to delete this corner point. Then I'll take my move point again. Let me just take the move parallel tool and reshape this segment so that my high hip position is in the correct place relative to the guidelines. Now I'm going to take my measure tool and measure the segment for the rise. If we look at the spec sheet, we can see that it's calling for 6 1/8 of an inch. So I click my segment length editor and I type in exactly 6 1/8 of an inch, and I'm going to make the adjustment at the first horizontal. That means I'm moving the first point along the segment in a horizontal direction to get to the required length. Next I'm going to look at my spec sheet and find out my knee position. So I can see that it's 13 inches down from the crotch. So I'm going to drag out a guideline, position it exactly at the crotch point. Then I double click on the guideline and offset it 13 inches to the left. And then I take my add point tool and add my grading points exactly in the position. So now let's go back to the spec sheet and look at our actual knee measurement, and we see it's 16 1/2 inches. So I'm going to take the move point tool and I'm going to lower my knee point in the Y direction 1 1/4 inches. So I'm doing this on both sides of the panel. So here I'm moving in the Y direction 1 1/4 inches. This is positive. Now we can take our measuring tool and measure from point to point, and we look at the Y measurement here and we see that this is 7 1/2 inches for the front panel. So the rest of it will be put into the back panel. Now we look at our spec sheet and we look at the leg opening. We have 19 inches given. So we can see here that currently I have 10 inches. So we need to lower the front. I'm going to do a 1/2 inch on both sides, because the front, of course, will be a little bit smaller than the back. So we'll have 9 inches on the front and 10 inches on the opening for the back. So now I'm going to delete this point here and delete the center line. Then we're going to select these 2 points at the hip and turn them into curve points. Then I'm going to take my move point tool and we're going to give a little shape to the waist. Make a curve point and give shape to the waist. So we finish up truing up the waistline using the move point tool until we're satisfied with the shape. And I can see here at the hip I can improve this a little bit more. So again, I'm going to true up the shape using the move point tool. So whatever changes we make here, we can always fix into the back pattern. So I'm moving this 1/8 of an inch to give me a nice cleaner hip line. So next we're going to measure the inseam to see that we're correct. So our inseam here is measuring at 34 inches. So you look at the spec sheet and confirm that our inseam length is asking for 34 inches. So next we're going to take the fold in tool and we're going to check the balance of our block. So pressing the Alt key, I go from point to point and I fold the top half to the bottom half. And if we zoom in here on the crotch area to see if we have balance. So we should have balance at the knee to the hem as well. So now we're going to make a copy of the front and click the paste button to make the back piece. So to rename this back, we simply double click inside the piece and I'll type the piece name as back. So the first thing we're going to do is move the point at the crotch, and I'm going to move this point 3.4 inches for my thigh. And then of course we need to add in at the knee because our back panel is bigger, so I'm doing 3/4 of an inch to maintain the balance. You can double check by looking at our spec sheet to make sure that we're using the right measurements. So I'm moving this point 3/4 and on the opposite side the same amount. This will keep the balance of the garment. Now going back to the spec sheet, we need to put that 1 inch back into the leg opening. So with the move point tool, I'm going to raise this point up 1/2 inch, and we put the other 1/2 inch on the other side. So this will give us a total of 19 inches leg opening. So once we have all our measurements in place, I can now go in and delete these points in the rise area for the back rise. I'm going to clear my piece, and then we're going to move this point for the hip. We need to raise that up a little bit. And if I delete these 2 points along the back waist, and now I'm going to take the move parallel tool and move this segment to get our nice waistline at the back. Moving this segment will not change that back waist measurement. So pressing the F8 key, we can see our line measurements. Now we need to measure our back rise segment. So currently I'm at 10.175 inches, and if we look at the spec sheet, it's calling for 11 inches. So first thing we're going to do is add some curve points and get this curve attribute. So now I'm going to drag out a guideline and raise up this hip measurement an inch, and I take my move point tool or move along tool, and I can move it right along the contour and raise that up. So let's measure again, and currently we are at 10.434 inches. So we're getting closer to the measurement. So taking the measuring tool, we're going to measure across the front thigh, and we see we got about 9 3/4 of an inch. And then I'm going to measure across the back thigh, and we see that we have about 13 1/8 of an inch. So if we take our calculator and add these two measurements, you'll see that we are just below 23 inches. So we need to add a little bit more in the thigh. So I'm going to take my move point tool and raise this up about 0.3 inches. And then I'm going to true up the shape again a little bit more, moving my points. Now if we double click on this corner point, we should check the point angle. This angle should not be less than 90 degrees. So we can see here that it's just over 90 degrees. Now once again, we measure the back rise, and now we can see that we are right at 11 inches, which is what it's calling for. Next, what I'm going to do is take the front, click on the point at the center, and put it onto the back. And here we can see if we're in balance. We have a nice perfect balance. So I'm going to separate my pieces and begin to walk. So I'm going to walk my front and back at the outseam. So using the walk tool, I click along the line, and I can see that it's a little bit off. So using the walk tool, I also check my inseam, and I can see that the back is just a little bit longer than the front. So say I measure, I got about 34.5 inches, and we need 34 inches. So using the move parallel tool, simply select the segment at the hem and raise it up 1/2 inch in the X direction. Again, if I measure from point to point, I can see that my segment is 34 inches on both front and back. Now we just need to make the correction to the outseam. So if we measure our front outseam, we see that it's 40.4 inches. So now I'm going to adjust the back outseam by first measuring, then clicking segment length edit, and I type in 40.4 inches, and here again I'm going to adjust this at the first point in a horizontal direction, and now our measurements are correct. So now I'll walk the two out seams again, click along the line, and we see that it matches up perfectly. Next we walk the inseams. So once the front and back are completed, now we can create the back yoke. The back yoke measurements are 2 1/4 and 7/8. So again, I'm going to add my point. First one is 2 1/4 inches and 7/8 of an inch from the previous point. And then I'll simply use the scissor tool and make a cut from point to point. And we separate our piece, and now we have the back yoke created. Now I'm going to take the move point tool and add a little fullness on both sides of my yoke for the dart. So here I'm going to add 1/8 of an inch on this side, and on the opposite side I'll do a 3/8 of an inch, because we're going to put a 1/2 inch dart into the back yoke. So now I'm adding my dart points. First I'll put in the center, and then I'll add a point on each side of the center point. We'll make that a 1/4 inch. Now after the points have been added, I simply select my points, click the Create Dart tool, and my dart is inserted, and then we'll go to the dart menu and close the dart. And then I can delete the dart and simply change my points to become curve points. Next I'm going to walk my yoke to see that it matches, and you can see here we have a perfect yoke. Matches up perfectly. Now if we go and look at our spec sheet and our sketch, we need to make the front patch pocket. So let's take a look at our measurements. So we got our front patch pocket opening, we got the horizontal height and vertical height from side seam. So first thing I need to do is bring in my guidelines. So double click on the guideline, and I'll offset this from the waist 8 1/4 inches down. Then I'll bring in a horizontal guideline, and we take a look at our measurement. So now we can double click on this, and this is going to be 5 1/2 inches. Then we also need the slash opening from side seam. So again, I bring down my guideline, and this is 3 3/4 of an inch. So now my guidelines are set. Oh, actually I do have one more measurement, and we need the pocket length here, so it's going to be 5 inches down from the waist. So next I'm going to use my drafting tool to draw in the pocket. So I click on each point. When I'm finished drawing, I simply right mouse click to finish drawing my pocket. And I'm going to add a point here in the middle, and I'll make that curve so I get my pocket opening shape. Now that this is finished, I'm going to delete the guidelines, and I'm ready to build my piece. So I'm going to take the build piece tool and simply click inside the area, and my new piece is newly created. I can now lift it out, and I have my pocket piece. Now we're going to name the piece, double click inside. This will be my front top pocket piece. And now I'm going to delete the draft line, the internal contour, just simply click on it and delete. Now we need to make our bottom pocket, front bottom pocket. So we have our measurements 5 3/8. So I'm going to make a rectangle. First thing I'm going to do is give it a name. This will be the front bottom pocket. So our X length is 5 5/8, and the width is calling for 5 3/8. So in the Y dimension, we type in 5.375 and bring the piece down onto the working area. Now I also need to make the flap piece. So if we look at our spec, the front flap width is 5 5/8, and the front flap length is going to be 2.5 inches. So let's plug in our measurements and click OK. And we bring that piece onto the working area. We double click inside to name it. This is going to be the front top pocket flap. Now I need to give the flap its pointed tip. So first I'm adding a point in the middle, and along the sides I'll offset this 3/4 of an inch, or 0.75 from previous point, and on this side it's going to be 0.75 from the next point. And then I simply click on the corner points and press the delete key to delete those points. Now I'm going to smooth out the curve at the knee by selecting the point and using the round corner tool. Put in a radius of 25 inches. This will help smooth out the rough edges. Okay, now we're going to continue on and make the fly. So we look at our spec. We have a fly. The fly length is calling for 3 3/4 of an inch. So I'm going to again make a rectangle. I'm going to name this the fly. So first we plug in the length, 3.5 inch, and our width is 1.5 inches. So now I'll move this piece into position, and we can use the round corner tool again, and here I'll put a radius of 1 inch to round off my corner. And if I take the walk tool and connect it, and I zoom in, I take the move point tool and move our point over to match up along the waist. So now the next step is to make the fly extension. So I'm going to make a copy and paste of this piece. And to make the fly extension, what I'm going to do is select these 2 points and set it as a half, and then open the half. So I open up this piece, and next I'm going to use the align points tool to straighten up the points. So I select my points, click the align points tool, and align these points up vertically. And now I'm going to select all the points along the edge and extend this 1/4 of an inch. So we double click inside the piece and we'll call this the fly extension. Now we're going to make the belt loops. So if we look at the loop, look at our sketch, our pant is requiring 5 belt loops, and they're going to be 2.5 inches in length. So we make a rectangle, call this loop, but we need 5 of these, so I'll make the X length 17, and my width is 2.5 inches. So now I'm just going to add to the description 5 loops, and also I need to put in the finished measurement, which is 2.5 inches by 1 inch, 2.5 inches length by 1 inch width. So I'm simply going to add this to my piece description. So next we're going to do the back pocket and the back pocket flap. So our pocket width is 6 and our pocket width length will be 6 1/8 of an inch. So again, we make a new rectangle, name this back pocket, and plug in the 6 inch length, 6 1/8 inch length, and our width was 6 inches. So we'll now make another rectangle to make the back pocket flap. So this asks for 6 1/4 inch and 2 5/8. Okay, the width here is 6 1/4. And just like on the other flap, we want to get that diamond shape, so we're going to add our point, our center point. And we're going to offset this 3/4 of an inch on both sides. And then we will delete the corner point to get our diamond shape for the flap. Now we need to set the back pocket position, and we can see here it's calling for from center back. So we're going to first we need to connect our back yoke to the back panel, and then I will bring in my guideline and let's set this from center back, and then we're going to double click and offset this 1.5 inches. Now I need a horizontal guideline. And this position is 3/4 inch down from center back. And we already know that our pocket width was 6 inches. So again, I need another guideline, 6 inches. Now I pick up the button tool and simply add my button. Okay, so once the buttonholes are placed, I can go ahead and delete those guidelines. And our back pocket placement has been set. Now, our last piece, we need to make the waistband. So our spec sheet has a 31-inch waist circumference. So we're making another rectangle, call it waistband. And we better look at the spec sheet because we need our 31 inches plus the J-stitch width. So that's another 1.5 inches. So we make a 33.5 by 1.5, and our waistband is now created. Now we need to add our seam allowance to all the pattern pieces. So we have a 1/2 inch seam allowance on the majority of our segments. So if we go to the seam menu and go to set global seam, we're going to type in a 1/2 inch seam width, and we're going to choose all pieces in the style. And then we can use our seam tool to go back and change the different seam widths. So at our hem, we need to change this to 5/8, and also I can engineer the corners, my seam corners at the hem as well. So this was done to the front. I must do the same to the back. Everything goes in a clockwise direction. So again, change this from a 1/2 inch to 5/8 of an inch. Choose my corners and click OK. So if we bring each piece down onto the working area, we see that all our pieces.
This 40-minute workflow can be reduced by 50% or more if the pattern maker has a library of balanced and pre-fitted blocks to start from instead of a rectangle. TUKA CAD comes preloaded with many of these basic blocks.
So make sure you save your file. So I'm going to just go ahead and save this file as my style number, which was given on the spec sheet. So my style number here for this project is 503-1030. Now, one of the last things I need to do is set the material and the quantities and the description for all my pieces. So if I go to the View menu and open up the piece list, I can see all my pieces in a list format. So in the material field, we're going to label all the pieces that belong to materials such as self and lining, and we have descriptions for each piece, so we can double click inside each piece and add our descriptions. Here I'm putting cut 2, and I'm changing the quantity to 2 per bundle and defining my opposite piece as up and down, and also setting the rotation allowance for the marker. So all this information can be set individually or it can be set globally. When I say globally, I mean I can put the same quantity or same descriptions
to multiple pieces. So we can do this from the list or from the piece info window. So once we fill out all the information and descriptions and quantities of material, this piece list can then be exported directly to Microsoft Excel, or it can be appended as a new sheet to an already existing Excel file. I do that by simply
To learn
right
more
mouse
about
clicking in the
Tukatech's
piece
rental
list.
program and other Tuka products and services,
So our style is
please
complete.
visit us on the web at
And we did this
www.tukatech.com.
pant in just a little bit under 40 minutes. So now this can be sent directly to eFit Simulator, where we can plot and cut a sample.